It's May in the garden, my friends. Possibly the best month to get started if you're not already. I've got a pretty ripping garden, but I still am planting some amazing crops this May. Both Jacques and I are gonna give you our picks and 3 more epic gardeners. Meg in North Carolina, Bethany in Chicago, a balcony and apartment grower, and Shani in Florida. So no matter where you live, we've got you covered. Let's get into what to plant this May. By the way, guys, today's video is sponsored by Shopify, but more on that later. This pick is one I used to not like as a kid. I remember sitting at the dinner table, throwing a tantrum like a little brat, not wanting to eat this, and then getting sent to my room by my mom. And if you're watching, Mom, sorry about that. I feel bad because now I actually really love this plant. And of course, I am talking about a squash. There are so many different types of squash, but I'm gonna be highlighting summer squash specifically because it's the one that you are typically enjoying when it's younger and you're kind of enjoying it in the season that you're harvesting it in, as opposed to a winter squash. The one I really want to show off though is a patty pan squash. I remember going to a farmer's market and seeing really tiny patty pan squash. I'm talking about maybe the size of a quarter or so. So I was asking the folks, I was like, well, what's the deal with these? It was like taking a scoop of patty pan and buying it by the pound. And they said, you know what you should do is cut them in half and saute them in a pan. It actually tastes a little bit egg-like, almost like a morning omelet. And I tried that and it was actually true. And so that's why I think a scallop blend is nice. You can have fun with it and you can pick them young and you can just kind of do whatever you want with them in the kitchen. Or if you want to get them up to size, then of course just let them grow out. But as far as squash planting goes, you can do what I've done here, where you just transplant out from your cells or however you're starting your seeds. But if you want to make your life even a little bit easier, grab 3 or 4 seeds, build up a little mound, pop them an inch or 2 down and just direct sow them. This is going to want to spread out and it's going to thrive, honestly, if you plant it right about now. So patty pan squash is one that after 30 years, Mom, I finally like.
If there had to be one plant that has a pretty confusing name, it is the entire world of winter squash. People assume that just because it's called winter squash, you have to grow it in the winter. That's not really true. It's actually called winter squash because you grow it in the summer to eat it in the winter due to its long storage potential. Now there's many different varieties of winter squash out there, but if I had to choose a single type, it'll always hands down be the kabocha. This is the Kuronishiki kabocha squash. The reason why I like kabocha so much is that A, it stores really well. I've had kabocha sit in my pantry for about 4 months without any problem whatsoever. They're sweet, but they're not just sweet. They have a very nutty, dense flesh that's very useful in a variety of different ways. So what is the best thing to do when it comes to growing any type of squash really, especially winter squash, is that they love organic matter. So I'm over here in this bed, which I have chopped and dropped the previous winter's crop. So this is all now broken down. And I also right here have a handy little 5-gallon bag full of compost. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take a nice pile of this compost and I'm going to start layering it right over here on top of my drip line. By mounding up the soil, it heats up sooner, faster, and that allows the seed to germinate much more readily. Now, the other reason why I'm using compost and a chop and drop bed is that squash absolutely thrives in organic matter, decaying organic matter. That's why it grows out of your compost bin so much, because it loves decaying waste like this. And then I'm gonna take a couple of these seeds, probably, you could do 2 or 3, and then you'll probably actually pare it down to just 2 in the end. So I'm gonna take one of these seeds here, press it down into this side of my mound, take the other 2 and fill in the rest of the gap here. Now, the only thing left to do is bury this. The squash will now emerge. I'll select 2 vines, and once those vines emerge, I'm actually going to be training them into this orchard area behind me. So the idea behind this is that by allowing these plants to vine and grow up into my little mini orchard here, the leaves will create their own natural sort of shade canopy and help mulch these trees even further. And there's really wasted space around these fruit trees anyway, so I might as well let the vines get in here and I'll harvest pumpkins later in the summer to eat in the winter.
If you've ever wanted to grow a little bit of magic in a cup and an antioxidant powerhouse right in your backyard, look no further than the blue butterfly pea. This gorgeous flower that made this delicious tea has a really unique scientific name, and it hails from Southeast Asia. Although this is a type of pea, they're typically not grown for their pea pods, but more for their flowers. The flowers are just the most lovely deep shade of blue, and apart from them being a highly medicinal tea full of all of these antioxidants and other good stuff. It's most commonly used as a natural food coloring to make these fun drinks, and the color changing magic happens when the tea is exposed to an acid like lemon juice. It changes the color from this deep blue color to like this purple or pink. This specific color is one of my favorite colors ever. Butterfly pea is a tropical plant, so it does thrive in warm and humid environments, which is why it grows so well for me here in North Carolina. They can get pretty massive. Like, you really only need one plant to get a pretty decent and continuous flower harvest all summer long, so they need a pretty sturdy trellis. These seeds can be a pain in the butt to germinate. So the first thing that we can do is you just take a knife or a pair of scissors and just make a little nick in the seed coat, and that just allows for water to get directly into the seed and speed up that germination process. You can also soak the seeds overnight before planting. You can do a combination of both, but if you're living in a colder climate and you want to try these out, you're going to want to start these in seed trays indoors a few weeks before your last frost. If your frost has already passed, like it has here in North Carolina, you can just direct sow these right into the garden. And these are tropical plants, so they really like the heat. So they're gonna start off kind of slow. And what I like to do as far as harvesting them is I'll just come out every single day. I will pick the flowers that are there because the flowers only last for one day. So you have one day to harvest them. And then I'll take them straight inside, straight to my dehydrator to dry them out. The flowers are really delicate, so it only takes a couple of hours to completely dry them out. Once they're dried, you're gonna store them in an airtight jar or a container, and they'll store there for up to 1 year.
This next one brings me all the way back to the very first plant I ever grew, and you OG Epic Gardeners know what it is already, but you don't know why I'm growing it this May, and that would be a pickling cucumber. The beauty of a pickling cucumber, it's not that you have to use it for pickling or that you can't pickle a normal variety, it's just that it's a little bit better suited for the purpose of pickling. And what I mean by that is that it is a little bit thicker, the flesh is more solid, the skin is a touch thinner, and it's got these little sort of black spines on it that make for a nice little pickle. So what I have here is a trellis. You need to grow this on a trellis. This one pack will actually grow about 20 feet of a trellis. So if you really wanted to, you could stack a bunch of these up and have just a gnarly A-frame cucumber trellis with an insane amount of pickles, because this variety produces quite readily and also quite early for those of you with a shorter growing season. You want to go in next to a trellis about an inch or two off, because they've got a nice tendril that will help them climb. So this sort of gridded A-frame style trellis is really good for that. And then just come in with your finger every 6 inches or so and sprinkle in just a few seeds, and then just cover that up. You can transplant them, you don't have to. It's fine either way, but we've found that a transplanted cucumber tends to grow at roughly the same speed as a direct sown one if you transplant and sow at the exact same time. So if I transplanted one next to this that I just sowed, you'd think that because the transplanted one is older, it would grow faster. Sometimes that's the case, but sometimes just being where it wants to grow from the very start of its life tends to help quite a bit. So as your cucumbers grow up your trellis throughout the course of the season, they'll kind of tendril their way up, they'll start to flower, they'll be pollinated, and then they'll develop some juicy pickles, right? And they'll come in on this inside of an A-frame trellis. You can come through and just snip them off and go ahead and start pickling. Simple as that. And speaking of simple, it brings us to today's sponsor, which is Shopify. I've been using Shopify as a business owner for over 5 years now. And in fact, without Shopify, I can very confidently say you probably would not be watching this video, because 5 years ago, when I started offering Birdie's garden beds to you guys, that was the easiest system I could have ever used to get that part of the business off the ground. I didn't know anything about commerce. I knew about gardening. So Shopify was there, making it very simple to set up a store, add products to the store, deal with shipping, taxes, all of the minutia of running the back end of a commerce business. So for us, it is absolutely crucial in our stack of apps and tools that we use to run Epic Gardening. So much so that when we acquired Botanical Interests, which is our seed company, we actually moved them over to Shopify as the very first thing we did after we became the new owners of the business, because we were using this old commerce platform where you had to literally call them to make a change to the website. So to make it easier for you guys to shop our store and for us to operate it, Shopify was our choice. So if you're looking to start a business, whether you're selling product online or offline, gardening or otherwise, Shopify is wholeheartedly the product that we recommend. You can grab a free trial down below. Link in description. Thanks to Shopify for sponsoring the video, and let's get back to our May picks.
If for some reason somebody told me that I could only grow one flower in my garden, it would be a very easy choice for me. And my choice would be zinnias, because they come in so many different sizes and colors, and they are incredibly productive flowers. Because they are cut and come again flowers, I can continue to harvest these throughout the entire garden season, and the more I harvest, the more flowers these plants will produce. I like to direct sow my zinnia seeds because they grow incredibly quickly, but they like warmer weather, so you want to wait until nighttime temperatures are at least 50 degrees or warmer. And if you want to extend the blooming time of zinnias, you can actually sow your seeds in 2-week increments. Zinnias do flower best in full sun, and they prefer fertile but well-draining soil. One of my other favorite things about zinnias is these are the most popular flower with pollinators in my garden, so I can always come outside and find a butterfly or a bee happily sitting on top of my flowers.
In a zone 9B, 10A like we have here in Central Florida, May is already hot. And by the time summer rolls around in a few months, it's going to be scorching heat, sky-high humidity, and ridiculous pest population. So I have to think hard. How am I going to keep things like summer squash and zucchini, which I love, on the table over summer? I've got to get creative and use some alternatives. And that is where our friend, the loofah gourd, comes in to save the day. Contrary to popular belief, loofah gourd is not an underwater animal or plant. It is actually a cucurbit related to cucumbers. They also happen to be one of the most versatile crops I've ever grown. Yeah, you can scrub-a-dub-dub with these bad boys just like you see them in your shower. They make the most fantastic sponge. But what I'm really after is the immature fruit, which have this incredible tasty and tender flesh. Culinary-wise, you use them just like a zucchini or summer squash. So we're talking muffins, breads. I've had them in stir fries. I love them in curries. You can even use one of those little machines and make them into the noodles, you know, like the zoodles, but maybe you call them a loodle or a loofle. So check it out. Here are my little loofah seeds. Now, I had typically been patient and just waited the 3 to 4 weeks for my seeds to germinate. Kevin just shared this really handy tip where he snips the end of the seed to hasten germination on the loofah seed. So I'm gonna try that this year, and I think it's gonna work out great. Now, you can direct sow these seeds, or you could start them in trays. If you're growing up north and you wanna get a jump on the season, I highly recommend starting them in a large tray. What's really important to remember, loofahs hate to be pot bound. My general rule of thumb with any cucurbit is once it has germinated, don't let it sit in that pot for more than 3 weeks, because those roots hitting the sides of the pot are going to impact the plant. Once they're in the ground, they're going to take off. Now we're going to sow these seeds about 1 inch deep or about 2 times the size of the seed itself. Loofah gourds like loose, well-drained soil. I've grown them in raised beds. I've grown them in rows. You can also grow them in pots. The most important thing I've found is that you really want to give them a strong trellis. I love growing them up in archway because you'll see these amazing fruit hanging down. They look like stalactites in a cave. They're super cool and a lot easier to harvest. Speaking of harvest, when do you pick them? So 1.5 inches and smaller in diameter is ideal for harvesting for edible fruit. This is when the taste and texture are the very best. If you miss that size, it's no big deal. You're just gonna get sponges. For a sponge harvest, I like to let the husk turn completely yellow and start to separate from the sponge interior. That's when it'll be the easiest to peel. Now, if you miss that and they go completely brown and dry, they're still gonna make fantastic sponges with an added bonus that you'll be able to harvest mature seeds for saving and planting next year.
No matter where you live, May is probably actually a great time to start the seed for this plant because it really thrives in the heat. That is why we are over here in this section of my garden where this bed gets sun throughout the entire day, and it actually is quite warm over here in the summertime. That plant is okra. Okra simply hates cold weather, it hates cold soil. It really doesn't want to go in the ground until the soil temperature is up into that 70-degree range. Even here in San Diego, we still haven't quite hit 70 degrees in our soil. The air is getting there, but not the soil. So let's go ahead and start these as transplants, and I'll show you a little trick on how to get these to germinate a lot faster. I actually chose 2 varieties for you today. One is Red Burgundy, if you want a little bit of color, contrast, and interest, and then Clemson Spineless 80, which is a classic variety. Here's what it usually looks like. It's a pretty green seed. It looks very hard if you feel it. It's almost like a little BB. So this can be quite tricky to germinate, especially if you are not very good at maintaining your watering. So what you want to do is actually soak the seed in some water for like 12 hours to maybe a full day, and that should speed up the germination dramatically. So what I'm going to do here, is sow a 6 cell that I haven't soaked and one that I have, and we'll see just how much faster the seed is to come up. Now, the reason why I'm transplanting it is because, like I said, the soil isn't quite warm enough for it to thrive. So by transplanting it, I'm buying myself a couple weeks of time here where I could wait for the season to warm up properly and get that bed ready for a whole field of okra.
Yard-long beans have many different names, but this one kind of just states the obvious. I mean, they really are beans that can grow to be a yard long. It's not an exaggeration. These beans are my absolute favorite beans to grow. I make space in my garden for them every single year. Just one of these yard-long beans equals like 7 or 8 green beans, and honestly, to me, they taste the exact same. These beans definitely need a sturdy trellis because they do grow very long vines, and they're not as early producing as other varieties of green beans. They do tend to start a little bit later in the season, but once they start, they do not stop until their first frost. Their roots can kind of be a little bit sensitive to root disturbance like other beans, so what I like to do is I like to just direct sow them right into the garden after the last frost.
The one crop I tell everybody I know that they have to grow in their garden because it tastes so much better right off the vine compared to what you can get in stores are tomatoes. Not only do they taste delicious, but they also look really beautiful in the garden, and you can find them in a wide variety of colors, anything from bright reds, deep purples, or even really beautiful yellows. You can choose determinate or dwarf varieties if you're gardening in a smaller space or perhaps growing in containers, or you can do indeterminate tomatoes, which will produce for about 2 to 3 months. I just know that for me, tomatoes really are the taste of the summer. If you're gonna sow your tomato seeds directly outside, you want to wait until after all danger of frost has passed and the soil temperature is about 60 degrees. I like to start mine inside because we have a slightly shorter growing season. That way I give them a little bit of a head start, but I keep them inside until danger of frost has passed. Then I transplant them into my garden. Tomatoes like a warm area in full sun, at least 6 to 8 hours of sunlight per day, and they also have a tendency to sprawl. So you want to make sure that you're giving them support with a tomato cage or some other type of staking system. You also want to aim for consistent moisture when you're watering because inconsistent moisture can cause the fruit to split. I absolutely love tomatoes. These are a must-have every season in my garden.
When you have an extremely hot summer climate, you need to look to alternative crops that are going to thrive in that heat. I bet you didn't know you could grow this one at home. It's jicama. This is actually a member of the legume family, and it's technically a perennial vine, but we harvest it for its roots in the first year, so we really treat it like an annual. These tubers are sweet and crisp. They kind of have an apple-like texture, and they're just a little less sweet than an apple. They're the perfect little snack. They're one of my absolute favorites. You really just want to eat them out of hand, sliced up. Germinating jicama seeds isn't particularly hard. Soaking them in warm water for 24 hours or sprouting them in a paper towel will help you get a little jump. Or you could just sow them into a large seedling tray. You just want to gently transplant them out into very warm soil. It's also important to note that the tubers are the only edible part of this plant. Please don't eat the other parts of the plant because they're poisonous. And don't get me wrong, it is a waiting game. They take between 5 to 9 months to mature, but they fix nitrogen in your garden like a true legume. They make these incredible tubers. Pretty easygoing plant, loves the heat. Jicama plants like well-drained sandy soil. They want 8 hours of direct sunlight. They love that heat. And they are not drought-tolerant plants, so please make sure they're getting consistent watering. A soaker hose or a drip line is perfect for jicama plants, keeping the water concentrated right at their root system. And we're just gonna make sure that the soil is not boggy, they don't have wet feet, but don't let them dry out. Now I'm spacing my plants a foot apart in rows 4 feet apart, and they're going to make 20-foot long vines. Now it is best to actually keep those vines cut back a little bit because that's gonna concentrate more energy to making big tubers. And the same goes for those beautiful purple blooms that are going to form. They're gorgeous, but you do want to snip them back if you can because those are also going to steal energy from your tubers, which is really what you want. And these tubers are going to have their best taste and texture when they're harvested between 3 and 6 inches in diameter. Anything over that is an impressive harvest, but it just doesn't taste as good.
For this next crop, I want you guys to close your eyes with me and imagine you're at a sushi restaurant. The vibes are high. The waitress brings you one of the most simple yet delicious dishes in the world. And I'm not talking about sushi. It's a bowl of steamed and salted edamame. and life is good. And imagine you grow your very own edamame right in your backyard. Edamame is also known as soybeans, and they're very, very easy to grow, just like most legumes are. They are bush beans, so instead of vining, they bush out, so they don't need any trellising, which is super convenient. I find that edamame does best when it's just direct sown right into the garden after your last frost. And they can be planted pretty densely, just giving them 2 to 3 inches apart. And they're gonna take anywhere from 80 to 100 days from seed to harvest. When it comes time to harvest your edamame, you wanna wait until those beans have filled out those pods quite a bit, but they're still gonna be bright green and those beans are still going to be tender. And once you harvest them, they are ready to either boil or steam, hit them with a little bit of flaky sea salt, and enjoy.
If you take a look around my garden, you'll probably notice that nothing is really by itself. It's surrounded by other plants, companion plants, if you will, and actually tomatoes in particular benefit a lot from having companion plants with them. And there are 3 major ones that I always use across my garden with my tomatoes. And I've even actually chosen 2 separate from each category. So what are those 3 different companion plants? Well, the first one is probably the most convenient, and that is basil. Basil is great alongside tomatoes, mostly for the convenience of having your basil right next to your tomato plant. You can easily harvest your tomatoes, grab a couple leaves of basil, make yourself a delicious salad or a pesto or whatever you really need. And also the smell has some properties that it can maybe deter some insects. I won't say that for sure, but at the very least, the basil is still beneficial just for the convenience of having it next to your tomato plants. Now, the next 2 are truly beneficial in the sense that they actually do have an important action when it comes to protecting your tomatoes, and that is marigolds, specifically the French marigold type. The French marigold type has roots that release a certain aroma or a certain sort of chemical, if you will, that will actually help deter and repel root knot nematodes from getting into your tomato roots and actually ruining them, stunting your harvest, and maybe even killing your plant. Now, of course, they are also flowers, so they will also attract beneficial insects and those kinds of things. But the main reason why I like to put these French marigolds between my tomatoes is that they repel those root knot nematodes. I could take any help I could get in that department. Now, the last 2 is another classic for me, and it is the alyssum. This is something I heard about a long time ago, and the reason why it's so beneficial for tomatoes in particular is A, it's a very small plant. It won't overtake your tomatoes and outcompete them. B, those tiny flowers are really good at attracting a arachnid wasp. It's a tiny little wasp that cannot sting you, it won't hurt you, don't worry. But what it will hurt are actually the tomato hornworms that munch down your tomato leaves overnight, leaving your plant bare. By having this, you're helping to attract all those beneficial insects to balance your garden and protect it without having to use any chemicals along the way.
This pick for me has quickly become one of my favorites. Was very challenging for me to grow as a beginner gardener, also as someone who didn't have as much space, and that would be the world of melons. Melons are a tough one to grow, but oh so satisfying. So if you are a short season grower, Minnesota Midget is the one for you. It's also a compact plant. It is a muskmelon or a cantaloupe. So this one is probably our top pick if those are your growing conditions. If you want to go a little bit wild, Sweet Delight, it'll do really well. The tip for really anyone growing a melon is to plant them much in the same way as the rest of my picks. A couple seeds to a mound, let them sprawl out, or you can train them upwards if you want to grow them in like a little container of some kind. Just need some sort of structure for them to climb up and be supported by. But it's really about giving them a lot of access to sunlight, keeping them nice and moist early on, maybe a little bit of fertilizer. You don't need a whole lot if you've got good soil. But the tip really comes in making sure you know when to harvest. This goes for watermelons, but of course it also goes for melons. So last season, I grew some of these varieties out. Here's what to know when it comes to the harvest. We're almost to the point where we can harvest and eat this delicious honey melon, but harvesting melons in general actually depends a lot on the variety. So take cantaloupes, for example, which this is not. This is more of a honeydew style. Cantaloupes are what's called climacteric, meaning that after you take them off the plant, they will continue to ripen up and sweeten up, whereas this honeydew really won't. So if, let's say you had a cantaloupe, what you'd be watching for is you'd be watching for that sort of rough, abrasive skin to get nice and rough. You'd look for that shine that's on the melon to kind of go away. Cantaloupes you can harvest what's called full slip, meaning that by just simply pulling, it will detach itself from the vine without too much effort from yourself. The moment has come, my friends. Let's see how this melon tastes. So, How do I know that this one's at least getting ready? Remember, a honeydew style is not climacteric and it is not ripe at full slip. So you kind of have to look for a couple different signs. The first sign is this. Take a look at this. Looks like nothing, right? That's actually the biggest sign. This is the tendril that is right behind this particular fruit, and this tendril is brown, shriveled, and dried up, which is a very good sign that this is getting close to being ripe. The other sign you want to look for, and this is an interesting one because it's more of a honey sort of melon with a different color, but you kind of want to look for the presence of a field spot. See, this is a little bit lighter here on the bottom, which is kind of what we're looking for. And then the skin itself should look a little more shiny and waxy and not as sort of dusty or dusky as it would earlier on in its life. The final thing you can do is give it a bit of a press here at this blossom end, and you should see a little bit of a springiness there or a little bit of a bounce back. And you can also give it a smell, and it should have a lightly sort of sweet smell. So this is the month, guys. May is the month. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you want some tips on how to and why to direct sow some of these picks, check out this video right here. Until next time, good luck in the garden and keep on growing.